Hello, and thank you for watching. My name is Bradford Roberts, Principal Broker, Founder, and Owner of TR Realty in the Las Vegas area. After watching this video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. Download the pertinent handouts for this video by clicking the link in the comments below. Now let's get started. This video is entitled Class 4 Seller Excellence, and the segment is entitled Counteroffers. It is your job to check every part of the offer, not just the price. Look at everything very carefully because you are the expert and you're going to be held responsible if things go badly or something is overlooked. So look at the earnest money deposit, look at all the dates and the deadlines, the due diligence period. Look at what your seller is being asked to pay for, things like repair credits and closing cost credits, etc. As the listing agent, you are handling the incoming offers and you may not act as a gatekeeper. You must present all offers to your seller immediately. And here in Nevada, there is no order. Sellers can accept, they can reject, they can counter offer, or in fact, they can completely ignore an offer comes in. But you cannot. You as a licensee are required to respond even if the seller does not. Now, optimally, we would like our seller to reject an offer rather than ignore it. And there is a place to do that at the end of the RPA, where the seller is going to check the box and then go ahead and sign that. And that would stave off any kind of complaint at the Realtor Association that you fail to present their offer. We don't want that to happen, and it's bad business also. But sometimes a seller is just insulted or, whatever the reason is that he doesn't want to go ahead and sign that rejection. You better do something to protect yourself. And what I recommend is an email, because that's going to be date and time stamped, to the other agent with a little bit of an explanation. Your offer was presented to the seller by, email, in person, a fax, whatever, certain day, certain time, and as of the writing of this email, I have not yet received any response from the seller. So that is going to go a long way if a complaint ever were filed against you for failure to present an offer. So remember, the seller is under no obligation to respond, but you are. In fact, we've seen these complaints over the years, especially since I serve on the Professional Standards Committee. I've seen lots of these things. So I have made it TR Realty company policy that we always respond to offers, even if our seller does not. It's just smart defensive real estate. I recommend that you try to avoid accepting an offer from a buyer who has not seen the property. I know in this day and age, we are doing more of these transactions than ever before. But if your seller chooses to take an offer from a sight unseen buyer, make sure you use the hold harmless agreement, which is a form that I cover in my Class 3 video series, which is buyer excellence. So the hold harmless agreement is a layer of protection for you as the licensee in case your seller is choosing an offer from a buyer who has not seen the property. We also want to be careful if our seller accepts an FHA or a VA offer if the property is not in good condition. So FHA and VA are going to require that the properties are habitable. They're in good condition. And if you allow your seller to accept an offer, FHA or VA buyer offer, and the property is not in good condition, you're going to end up tying up the property for quite some time before the appraisal process even happens. And then when it happens, you're at a severe risk of there being funding conditions, certain repairs that would need to get done before the transaction can close. Don't put your seller in that situation. As I have talked about in my Class 3 video series, the FHA buyer, unfortunately, has some disadvantages. Most sellers prefer cash. If it's not cash, the second choice would be conventional financing. But FHA is typically not anyone's first choice. And there are reasons for that, as I talk about in Class 3. One is the difficult appraisal process, which often includes funding conditions. Another one is the fact that FHA buyers put very low down payments on the property. They don't have a lot of skin in the game, and the cancellation rate is higher than the cancellation rate for conventional or cash buyers. So we have created a clause that in effect will attempt to level the playing field. When I say level the playing field, I'm talking about a situation where we're working with an FHA buyer and the buyer is having a lot of difficulty getting an offer accepted anywhere. Again, he's competing with cash or conventional, and typically sellers prefer those over FHA. So please grab your clause library, one of today's handouts, and I'd like to bring you to clause 4.05, which says, buyer hereby agrees to assume any and all liability in conjunction with buyer's FHA mortgage application or commitment. Should any FHA inspections and/or appraisals mandate repairs, alterations, or improvements of any kind, buyer agrees to perform same at buyer's own expense and risk. Buyer understands and agrees that any deficiencies on the property that may impede mortgage approval shall not be a reason to terminate the purchase agreement, and buyer hereby waives the right to cancel under this provision. So, what this language is doing is shifting those extra responsibilities onto the buyer's side. Again, sellers typically don't want FHA offers because of the repairs and the difficulties. So if we have a buyer who's willing to assume that liability, if there is a repair that must be done as a funding condition, the buyer is willing to step up and get that done by himself. That will make his offer more competitive. And that is language that might work in that situation. Let's not trust another company's paperwork. There are lots of real estate brokers out there who create their own forms, their own disclosures, their own addenda, and that sort of stuff. I don't like that. We at TR Realty do not have any kind of forms that we ever ask the customer of another company to sign. We do have our own forms that we ask our customers to sign, but never across the aisle. And because of that, I always recommend that we avoid other companies' paperwork as well. Of course, you would always be even more cautious of anything that was added into additional terms on the RPA or any other contract that we might be using. But we want to have our customers, our sellers in the case of today's class, only sign the standard paperwork and not sign the XYZ Realty all-inclusive addendum disclosure, whatever crap some other company has come up with. Now, in today's class, you are the listing agent, which means the vast majority of time you're going to be receiving the offers that were written by agents. And a lot of times when you receive an offer written by an agent in another company, they do go ahead and attach all kinds of other stuff that was created by that company. So my recommendation is that we counter offer that stuff right out of the transaction. And I'd like to bring your attention back to the clause library, clause 4.06, where we actually have standard language to deal with that. 4.06 says, seller hereby requests all forms used in this transaction to be exclusively LVR and NRED forms. All other forms shall be excluded forthwith. So that would be the language that we could counteroffer with to get all of that other broker's specific paperwork out of the transaction so that we're only using the standard paperwork. We're not using anything that was created by any other broker. Remember, as we're looking at offers, the higher the LTV, the riskier the appraisal price. LTV, as we talk about in the Class 2 video series, LTV stands for loan to value. So when I say the higher the loan to value, means the higher percentage of financing that the buyer is getting, the more important the appraisal becomes. So remember that when you're reviewing offers. If you've got one offer for $200,000 cash, and you've got another offer for $200,000 with a 95% loan, the first offer is probably better. Again, the higher the percentage of financing, the riskier the appraisal. The riskier the appraisal, the higher chance the transaction can fall apart. One of the strategies that, unfortunately, in my opinion, is not used very frequently but should be in real estate is the concept of the earnest money going hard. When we use the term in real estate, going hard, we mean that it becomes non-refundable to the buyer. And the strategy of using EMD to go hard means that the buyer is putting more skin in the game. The buyer is taking some of the risk. One of the things that listing agents can do to hurt their own sellers is when a buyer's agent says, we need more time on the appraisal contingency or the loan contingency, or we need more time to close escrow. Sometimes listing agents will just go along with that. They'll just allow their seller to sign some kind of an extension on the time and not ask for anything in return. In my opinion, this is a perfect opportunity when the buyer and the buyer's agent come to the listing agent and say, we need this, or we need that, or we need more time, or even in the case that they're asking for repairs to be conducted, where now the seller is going to take time, effort, and spend money to get certain repairs done, never even knowing if the transaction is going to close. So these are scenarios where we can use that concept of hard EMD. I'd like to bring your attention back to the clause library, specifically to clause 4.07, which says, seller and buyer hereby agree that earnest money in the amount of X shall be considered non-refundable to buyer as of some date, except in the event of seller's breach or seller's inability to close escrow for any reason. Upon effectuation of this provision, buyer acknowledges that A, all of buyer's contingencies are deemed to be satisfied, removed, and or waived, and B, if buyer fails to close escrow for any reason other than seller's breach or seller's inability to close, then the earnest money deposit will be released to seller at seller's discretion with no further instructions to escrow holder necessary. So again, rather than allowing the seller to go out on the limb, do repairs, just give extra time and get nothing in return. And don't forget, when COE is delayed, the seller is incurring more costs, right? He's paying utilities, taxes, insurance. Many sellers are paying interest on the mortgage, association fees. So there is a cost to the seller to grant the buyer an extension to close escrow. That's a good time, in my opinion, to lock that buyer in, get that earnest money hard, and make sure that buyer is committed to the transaction. And let's take that one step even further. There's another concept, and actually we could borrow this concept from banks, because banks with their REOs use this strategy all the time. And that is to ask for a daily penalty when the buyer needs extra time to close. Just keep something in mind. If a buyer and seller effectuate a contract to close on a certain date, and the buyer can't close by that date, he is at risk of default. It's on him. And I've seen so many buyers say, well, it's not me, it's my lender. Yes, it's your lender. It's the lender you've chosen. And you are ultimately responsible for the performance of the lender you have chosen. So yes, ultimately, it is your fault and your responsibility. So there's a concept that would allow for the buyer to pay a daily fee to the seller for every day of extension that buyer might need. And we refer to that in real estate as a per diem, P-E-R, second word D-I-E-M, which is a Latin phrase that means by the day. So probably that makes sense to you. And I'd like to bring your attention back to the clause library once again to clause 4.08, which says, seller and buyer hereby agree that in consideration of parties' agreement to extend COE beyond the date stated in the RPA or any addendum thereof, as a condition of and upon successful COE, seller shall charge to buyer and buyer shall credit to seller a per diem in the amount of X dollars for each calendar day COE is delayed. Now, I want to caution those of you who also work with buyers, because if you are too optimistic when you put a closing date in the contract, and we're going to talk about this a lot more in my video series 5, which is my contract class, but if you put an overly optimistic closing date, and now we're getting up to that closing date and the buyer's lender or the buyer for some reason is unable to perform, and now the buyer needs to go back to the table and ask for more time, you are putting the seller in a very powerful position, because he could either grant the time and maybe ask for something in exchange, such as hard EMD, such as a per diem, or he doesn't have to go along with the extension. He can simply declare the buyer in default at the scheduled COE date if the buyer hasn't performed, and that would put the buyer's EMD at risk. In fact, contractually, I'm not a lawyer, but contractually, my understanding would be that the seller would be entitled to the EMD due to the buyer default. So, heads up on that one. The next thing I would like to discuss in this video is the actual counteroffer form. It's a pretty simple form. I'd like you to get that in front of you right now. And the first thing you might notice on the counteroffer form is that at the top it says counteroffer number blank. That's because the counteroffers get numbered sequentially. So the first agent who drafts a counteroffer is going to put number 1 and number 2, etc. And the numbers are never reused. So even if we draft a counteroffer that is not effectuated by the parties, we do not repeat that counteroffer number. That is for future reference and for the maintenance of our records. That is the reason why. At the top of this form, it says attention to the agent and company on the other side. Are you counteroffering an offer, or are you counteroffering another counteroffer? We would check the appropriate box. Who made that offer or counteroffer? Was it a buyer or seller? We would check the box and fill in the name that applies. Is it to buy or to sell? Real property, commonly known as, that's where we would put the address of the subject property. Dated blank, we would put in the date. Is not accepted in its present form, but the following counteroffer is hereby submitted. And the purpose of the counteroffer is to itemize those things that are in disagreement. Let me say that again, the things that are in disagreement. We would never say in a counteroffer, seller agrees to the purchase price. No, that's not what a counter means against. So we only list those things that are in dispute. And the very, very simple, clean, and logical way to do this is to number those items that you wish to counteroffer, 1, 2, 3, etc. And what you would do on each one is to cite the specific page, paragraph, and line number that you wish to change, followed by the words shall be, and then whatever that change is. So let's go through that one more time. Let's say, as an example, the seller wishes to counteroffer the price. So we could put here in this paragraph number 1, and then we could put page 1, referring to page 1 of the RPA, paragraph 1, line, whatever the line number is relevant, shall be, and we would put in that new purchase price. And this way, anybody will be able to follow along, rather than writing some sentences and paragraphs and language that, number 1, you're practicing law without a license. Number 2, you're making it difficult for people to follow along. And number 3, you're possibly creating language that might conflict with the language in the RPA. So we don't want to do that at all. We want to go item by item, page, paragraph, line, shall be, and then the change that we wish to make. And then it says, additional page is attached. This counteroffer is not complete without the additional terms on the attached page. We would check that box if, in fact, there's not enough space on this counteroffer and we need to attach an additional page. It says all other terms to remain the same as original RPA. All other terms to remain the same as original RPA, which is why we never say this is in agreement or this is okay with the seller, etc. We only list those things that are not. And then it gives us a chance to include any other counteroffer information that we might be agreeing to. There's an expiration date in the middle of the page, also known as a sunset provision, by which this counteroffer would expire were it not signed and delivered by the party on the other side of the table. And after that sunset provision, you can see that this needs to be dated, timed, and signed by the person who is proposing this counteroffer. And then we have dotted lines, and under that, the other side now has a chance that they can accept it. They can accept it subject to a different counteroffer. They can reject the counteroffer, whatever they decide to do. That party should be signing, dating, and timing on the bottom. And I'd also like to remind you that counteroffer form that we are using cannot be used once we effectuate a contract. This is only used during the counteroffer stage of negotiations. Once we have an effective contract, we don't have an offer anymore. We have a contract, right? And therefore, the counteroffer cannot be used. Now, you might notice the way this counteroffer is designed, that either party can draft it and present it, and then the other party has the right to accept it at the bottom. So what I'd like to bring to your attention is how careful we need to be not to sell the same house to two different buyers. What do I mean by that? Let's say you're a listing agent and you receive two offers on your listing. You and your seller decide to counteroffer both of those offers. You pull out two counteroffers, you put the terms of one in one, you put the terms of the other in the second one, and you send those back to the buyer's agents. If those buyers both accepted the terms of the counteroffers, you would have now sold that house to two different buyers. And that's why this counteroffer form should never be used if you have more than one offer on the table. Is that clear? So, I'd like to bring your attention to the very next handout for today's video, known as the seller's multiple counteroffer. Now, if you are in a situation where more than one offer comes in before you can respond to it, you must use this multiple counteroffer. It is very similar, and on the top, it does call for the sequential numbering. Also, when it comes to the multiple counteroffer form, I want to alert you that the seller is under no obligation to present the exact same multiple counteroffer to every buyer. The seller has the option. He could counteroffer some terms and conditions to one buyer, different terms and conditions to another buyer, because the seller's multiple counteroffer ultimately leaves the seller in control. Even look at the titles. The form that we just covered is called a counteroffer. The form we are about to cover is called the seller's multiple counteroffer. And again, that's because it leaves the seller in the ultimate power position. The form is laid out quite similarly, but there are a few things that I'd like to bring to your attention in here. So let's go to paragraph 1, where it says seller is making one or more multiple counteroffers to other prospective buyers on terms that may or may not be the same as contained herein. So I think that reiterates what I said a minute ago. Acceptance of seller's multiple counteroffer by buyer shall not be binding unless and until it is subsequently finally accepted by seller and the final acceptance is delivered. How many times in my classes do I talk about how essential the component of delivery is when it comes to the legal binding effect of a contract? In other words, if we don't have the component of delivery, we don't have an effective contract. I've said that so many times. And I'd like to bring your attention further in that paragraph where it says, until final acceptance, the parties understand that the property can be sold to someone else, and or either party may withdraw any offer, counteroffer to buy or sell the property. Yep, until we have an effective contract, we have nothing. Paragraph 2 says, paragraphs in the offer that require initials by all parties but are not initialed by all parties are excluded from the final agreement. And that is something that I've said as well, that whenever there's a separate paragraph or separate provision that has its own initials, unless it's initialed by both parties, that entire provision will not apply. Paragraph 3 gives you a chance to add something here. Be very, very careful, and you should consult with your broker before you add anything in here. Paragraph 4, check if applicable. Seller has received multiple offers. Seller requests buyer to submit their highest and best offer for consideration by the seller. So up until the time that this form was created, I don't know, a couple of years ago or so, we used to have a clause in our clause library that I've taught for over a decade for my associates to use to get the highest and best. We used to refer to that as an H&B MCO, highest and best multiple counter offer. If you're the listing agent and you are in the enviable position of having lots and lots of offers on your property in a short period of time, rather than the seller go line by line, item by item on each of those offers, the seller could make it a lot quicker and easier for himself by doing an H&B MCO. And basically in that situation, all we're going to do is take one of these seller's multiple counteroffer forms that we're talking about. We're going to drop down to paragraph 4, have the seller go ahead and initial that, and now you can take this form and send the same form to every buyer's agent. Just that simple. Now, statistically, I can tell you that about half of buyers, when they see the multiple counteroffer form with a request for highest and best, about half of them go away. They either feel that they don't want to get into a competitive situation, or it makes them nervous, or whatever reason, about half go away. About a quarter of them will actually stand firm on the offer they have. So they might get in touch with the listing agent and say, the offer we submitted is in fact our highest and best. And then, in my experience, about a quarter of the people will fall all over themselves to outbid themselves. They will increase the offering price, they'll raise the EMD, they'll put up an additional security deposit, they'll shorten their due diligence period, they'll drop their request for a warranty, whatever it happens to be. They will do better, they will write their offer cleaner, hoping to get the property. Now, if you've got, let's say, 3 offers on your property, and you and the seller decide to do an H&B MCO, you're at serious risk of losing all of those buyers. But if you put a property on the market and you've got 30 offers, then you have the luxurious position of saying, hey, if half of these buyers walk away because we asked them for an H&B MCO, then we've still got 15 buyers in the game. So this is a strategy that the seller and the listing agent need to work through together. And then I'd like to bring your attention about 80% down the way of the seller's multiple counteroffer form, where it says expiration. This counteroffer shall expire unless a copy hereof with buyer's written acceptance is delivered. And you see that that also calls for the date and the time. So that would be a sunset provision that we are imparting to the other side, giving them the opportunity to respond. Then should they fail to respond by that day and time, then their offer is no longer in contention. Let's go to the second page of the seller's multiple counteroffer to where it says buyer's response. So when the seller opts to use this multiple counteroffer form, it is then presented to the buyer's agent and subsequently to the buyer, who has choices or a choice to make from the following choices. He accepts the counteroffer, he accepts the terms of this counter subject to some other counteroffer, or he flat out rejects the counteroffer. He can make that choice. He needs to date, he needs to sign, and I would love to see the time in there as well. And then this document volleys back to the seller, who is now responding to whatever the buyer said above. The seller is willing to accept it, subject to the terms of some other counteroffer, or the seller straight out rejects that counteroffer. Again, signature, date, time, this time by the seller. But I want to bring your attention halfway down that second page. And this is a critical component of this seller's multiple counteroffer form, where it says in capital letters and bold print, seller's final acceptance. Remember I said that this form leaves the seller in the ultimate power position? Here's why. Seller accepts the counteroffer and creates a binding agreement. Seller revokes all other counteroffers by separate notice and agrees to sell the property to the buyer subject to the terms and conditions contained herein. Seller's final acceptance. So unlike the counteroffer form, which could be drafted and presented by either side and possibly accepted by either side, which would put us under contract, with the multiple counteroffer form, it will not be effectuated unless and until it is approved by the seller himself. And again, the purpose of that strategy is so that we don't sell the same house to two different buyers. So there is the multiple counteroffer form. I know it's a bit complicated. I know we talk about H&B. If necessary, feel free to rewind this video, go back, take another look at it, but the explanation is there. Having said that about the offer and the counteroffer, there are transactions where the sides can go back and forth many, many times. You might see counteroffer 1, counteroffer 2, counteroffer number 17, okay? At some point, it becomes convoluted and difficult for people to follow. They just can't follow 17 addenda on one contract. There's also cases where if you're offering, counteroffering, multiple counteroffering back and forth many times, you might have a title company and or a lender step in later and say, we can't follow this. This is too difficult. We need some clean paperwork. So here's my suggestion to you. If you're finding a situation with lots of counteroffers or lots of multiple counteroffers, at some point, be the adult in the room, step up and do a brand new RPA. Incorporate the changes that have been agreed upon in those counteroffers, get them into a new RPA, nice, clean, fresh RPA. Either agent can do that at any time during the counteroffer process. It doesn't necessarily have to come from the buyer. And when we are handling multiple offers, we talked about this. I just want to circle back and hit it one more time to make sure it's clear. When we're handling multiple offers, part of the counteroffer should always be a deadline, because there might be 2 or 3 or 26 buyers on the hook that if we can't get something going quickly, they're going to move on to another property. Don't let one prospective buyer hold you up, because looking for that one bird in the hand, you could end up losing all the birds in the bush, if you'll pardon my analogy there. So be careful about that. Give the parties tight deadlines. Listen, if you're in the middle of negotiations to buy a house there's no reason you can't respond within 24 hours. I don't think we need to give anyone more time than that. Now, here's another strategy that I want to share with you. And I do not see a lot of brokers using any kind of a strategy like this. And the strategy has to do with backup offers. So let's say you are in the enviable position of receiving lots of offers on your property. What most agents will do is do a multiple counteroffer. They'll go back and forth a few times with maybe a few of those buyers until they get one of those buyers that they and the seller wish to choose. At that point, they will effectuate a contract with the seller. And what happens to all the other interested buyers? They will let them burn. They will let them go away and find another property. Let's fast forward. Now we get this property under contract. We get into the due diligence period. We get into the appraisal situation, the inspection, the resale package, and many other contingencies to a typical RPA. You know there's a risk that the contract will fall apart, right? The buyer has those rights of cancellation. Most of them are unilateral, means he doesn't need the seller's consent. The buyer can say, I'm within my due diligence and this house is too perfect, I hate perfection, that's it, I'm out of here. Or he could object to something in the resale package, or the appraisal could come in low, or he might not like the results of the inspection. All kinds of reasons the buyer can bail on you. And folks, if that happens to you, what most agents do is they cancel the contract and they put the property back on the market. And now the whole thing starts all over from the beginning. New showings, new appointments, more people traipsing in and out of the property, more offers coming that need to be reviewed and counteroffered. Folks, you're burning all your time, you're burning the seller's time, you're increasing the seller's cost for carrying that property. We could be a little bit smarter than that if we wish to be. Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of a backup offer. And unfortunately, to most real estate licensees, what a backup offer means is they're going to take that piece of paper, they're going to throw it on their kitchen counter, and if their primary buyer bails out of the contract, they'll probably call up the other agent and say, oh, I lost my buyer, are you still interested? I think we can do better than that. And my strategy is, again, if you're in that situation where you've got multiple offers, let's take not one, but 3 contracts on that property. What the heck is Brad talking about? How can we sell the property to 3 different people? Here's how. We're going to sell the property like we would normally sell a property by effectuating an RPA. And that would be with what I'm going to call the primary buyer, the buyer that is in first position, the buyer that we would like to sell the house to. However, we can also effectuate an RPA with 2 or more, if you wish, other buyers, as long as those others contain backup language. Okay? That's how we do it. So I want to bring your attention back to the clause library. Let's fire up clause 4.09. Please get that in front of you. And let's give it a read together. Seller and buyer hereby agree that this is a backup offer and shall only take effect with written notice and agreement of both parties. Let that sink in for just a second. Shall only take effect with written notice and agreement of both parties. So we are effectuating a contract, but we've got a clause, this clause in the contract that says, even though this contract is effectuated, it's not effectuated yet. Psychologically, this is much more powerful than leaving a backup offer sitting on your kitchen counter. And the chance of a backup buyer, when you actually effectuate the contract, working out is significantly higher than if you just leave it on your table and you call them if and when your primary buyer falls out of escrow. So let's look at this sentence one more time. Seller and buyer hereby agree that this is a backup offer. So full disclosure to the parties. And shall only take effect with written notice and agreement of both parties. How would we give written notice that a backup buyer is now ready to jump in? Very, very simple. We are going to do an addendum to the RPA, and it's just one sentence. Seller and buyer hereby agree to remove that sentence. Did you get that? So if the parties do an addendum to remove that language, that backup clause 4.09, that clause comes out, guess what we have now, folks? We have an effective contract. I was asked when I taught this class live recently, an agent asked me, well, what if the buyer has moved on? What if the buyer doesn't want the property anymore? Well, what if? Because when the first buyer falls out and the listing agent sends the addendum to the buyer's agent to remove this language, the buyer simply doesn't sign it. And if the language is not removed, the contract is not effectuated. If the contract is not effectuated, the parties are free to go their merry way. There's just a couple of more things that I want to talk about in this particular segment. And one of them is the concept of repairs. So I am a proponent of selling real estate as is. As I've talked about in other classes, I always believe that repairs are deal killers. The reason is the sellers who are emotionally detached and on the way out, they want to do repairs quickly, cheaply, and they're going to get out of the house. They don't care if the day after they move that the repair breaks down again. Buyers, on the other hand, are spending a lot of money to move in. Maybe it's their dream home. They're going to be there for a while, and they want a good quality repair. So I recommend that we avoid repairs whenever possible. But if your seller is either contractually obligated to do a repair, or if that repair is a funding condition and therefore the seller must perform that repair, we only use Nevada licensed contractors. And be smart as a listing agent, you will get a copy of the receipt for your file so that, a year after close of escrow, if that buyer pops up and says, I have a problem with the repair, or I'm going to sue that company or whatever, you've got a copy of the receipt showing it was a Nevada licensed contractor who conducted that repair. And for those of you who have not yet seen my video series class 3, which is my buyer's class, you know that I like fixing things with money whenever possible, either by reducing the contract price, which is a great strategy for a cash transaction, or by having the seller give some sort of a credit to the buyer at close of escrow in lieu of repairs. That is a better strategy when the buyer is getting a mortgage. And lastly, in this particular video, I would like to go to a form known as the T-Status Authorization. Please pull that handout in front of you right now. And the title of the form, T-Status Authorization, the T stands for temporarily off the market. This is a form that unfortunately has been abused by real estate licensees. There's been countless cases where real estate licensees thought they unilaterally, without even the seller's consent, they could just take that property off the market. They could put it into T-status for whatever reason they wanted to do that. Of course, you can't do that. So over the years, our association has attempted to tighten up this form. In my opinion, it could still use a lot of tightening to ensure that real estate agents don't abuse it. And what they've done on the most current update of this form is to give us only 5 possible scenarios on this form that we could legitimately use it for. And each of those 5 scenarios comes with it a number of days that the association would allow the property to be in T status. So let's take a look at the middle of the T status authorization form. It says date T status to commence. and date to return to updated status. So no longer could a property be put in T status and just sit there in perpetuity. We need a start date, we need an end date now on the T status. And there are the 5 scenarios. Seller is unable or unwilling to allow showings. There are situations where sellers just want to put the pause on their showings. Maybe somebody in the house is sick, maybe they have visitors, who knows what the reason is. But as you can clearly see next to item number 1, there is a 30 business day maximum time period that you could leave the property in T status because the seller doesn't want showings. Scenario number 2, problems or concerns relating to title of property. You can see here, because title issues, especially things like clouds, encumbrances, liens, could take a while to clear up. Here is a 90 business day maximum on this provision. The third one, property is damaged. If something happens to the property and it needs to be repaired, you can see that we have up to 30 business days to put the property in T status because of that. The fourth one, seller is negotiating or reviewing multiple offers. This is a very tight 7 business day maximum, and I'm going to come back and talk about that one in just a second. Let's finish up with the list. Number 5, the key is lost or damaged and is being replaced. In this case, there's only 4 business days that the property can remain in T status. And I said I'd come back to number 4. I want to share with you a little strategy for those of you really paying attention in this video. So let's go back for a second and talk about the H&B strategy that we covered a few minutes ago. If I were a listing agent and I were in the position of getting many offers on my listing, here's a strategy that I might employ. Try to follow me. I might do a seller's multiple counteroffer form along with paragraph number 4 that says seller is requesting buyer's highest and best offer. And I might send that to my seller along with the T status authorization form, choosing option number 4, which would allow us to go temporarily off the market while we review offers. What a great strategy. Very simple, very clean. If I've got offers falling like rain, I need to stop it. I've got too many offers coming in. An H&B multiple counteroffer along with a T status authorization choice number 4 is going to allow me to take control of my time. The broker must sign the T status authorization along with the seller to be valid. It's signed, dated by the listing agent as well. It says this form does not constitute a valid status change unless it's signed by the broker. That is critical. Never go into T without the broker's signature. It is a violation if you were to do so. I would like to thank you for watching this video. I hope it was informative for you. If you are licensed with another brokerage in Southern Nevada and would like to talk with me, please text me or visit our website. See you next time.